Unit 16, Winds of War. We're going to talk about the lead up to World War II and the first 2 years of World War II. This is Unit 16. We're going to be explaining the international rise and spread of fascism, communism, and totalitarianism. We're going to look at President Franklin Roosevelt's response to the world crises, analyze the response of the United States, explain the reasons for American entry into World War II. What are the big concepts for this lecture? The effects of World War I and the Great Depression, which we've covered previously, led to the rise and spread of dictatorships, primarily in Germany, Italy, Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union, and Japan. The leaders of these countries promised their people improved lives at the loss of personal freedoms. Germany, under the leadership of the Nazi Party, began the persecution of political opponents. Undesirables and Jewish people were the primary targets, blamed for a lot of the issues following their loss in World War I. This culminates in the Holocaust, the mass genocide of Jewish Europeans. Germany, Japan, and Italy began to seize their neighbors and neighboring territories for economic and military advantages. This is going to be occurring in the 1930s throughout the Great Depression. Without the United States as a member of the League of Nations, remember this was what Woodrow Wilson wanted the United States to join. It was his idea following World War I. Without America in the League of Nations was helpless to stop these aggressive countries. The American public is far more concerned about the Great Depression and their own issues, jobs, and paying for rent or their mortgages and paying for food, and they wanted the United States to remain isolationist and neutral towards the acts of these aggressive countries. However, Franklin Roosevelt feels that the United States should begin to help its democratic allies around the globe. World War II begins in September 1939 when Germany invades their eastern neighbors, Poland. The United States maintains neutrality for almost 2 years, a little bit over 2 years, until Japan attacks the American naval base, Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii. Let's go over the key vocab for this unit. Fascism. Fascism rises in Europe, primarily in Germany, with the rise of the Nazi Party and the fascist Italian Party in Italy. It's a one-party dictatorship with a centralized government. It tends to be militaristic and racist. So you have the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and the rise of a militarized government in Japan. And you have the rise of the fascist party, the original fascist party in Italy. We have communism. Communism arises. The first communist state is Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union. It's the most powerful communist state. It's a one-party political system. So there's only one party, the Communist Party. And they control the economy and society. So industry is controlled by the communist government. There's no private property. There's a rejection of religion. And the Soviet Union is the first communist state, with the Bolshevik Revolution following Russia's severe losses in World War I. And communism comes from the beliefs of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and they wrote books like Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. And belief in the workers controlling the state, the means of production. So fascism and communism can be bundled up together into the term totalitarianism. And that's when your government rules through propaganda and fear. It restricts individual opposition to the state and its claims. People who opposed the government were often put into labor camps or concentration camps, killed or assassinated. There's a high degree of control over public and private life. Fascist and communist countries are totalitarian states. First fascist leader is Benito Mussolini. He rises to power and will be the dictator of Italy. And Adolf Hitler, he's the fascist leader of Germany, and he leads the Nazi Party. Joseph Stalin, he's the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. The purpose of these fascist and communist leaders was to rebuild their nations. There's a large focus on industrialization and militarization. And in the 1930s, Nazi Germany begins to violate the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding their military and finding loopholes in the restrictions on the size of their military forces. And they begin to seize lands that they'd lost following their defeat in World War I. Italy builds up its military and invades the East African country of Ethiopia. As Germany becomes more aggressive, Britain and France, our allies in World War I, attempt to appease Nazi Germany to prevent war. It's called the Munich Agreement. Hitler promises to stop his aggressive acts after taking Western Czechoslovakia. Now our president, Franklin Roosevelt, who remember back in our previous lecture, was elected in 1932. He's going to win 4 elections. So he's our president through most of the war and the build up to the war. He sees problems overseas and he begins to give speeches trying to convince the American public that the United States should actively help to protect democracies and freedoms around the world. And one of his famous speeches was the quarantine speech given in 1937, aimed at these totalitarian states, Germany, Italy, and Japan. He called for the democracies of the world to quarantine them, to prevent them from spreading and conquering their neighbors. Unfortunately, the former allies, are unable to prevent these aggressive nations from invading their neighbors, and World War II officially begins in September 1939 when Germany invades Poland from Poland's western border, and the Soviet Union, through a secret agreement, invades Poland on its eastern border, and Poland is conquered and split between these two totalitarian states. Germany is going to have war declared upon it by Great Britain and France. Great Britain and France were allies with Poland, and they declare war on Germany when it's conquered. Germany turns its forces to the west and conquers Western Europe, most importantly France. And from this, Germany begins bombing Britain. Adolf Hitler breaks his truce with Stalin and in the summer of 1941 invades east into the Soviet Union. The fascists and the communists traditionally hated each other, and Hitler dreamed of conquering Russia for Lebensraum, living space for the German people, more land for food and oil, and to conquer the Jewish people residing there. So here's the beginning of World War II. We see the German invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. So you can see that from the west, Germany invades, and from the east, the Soviet Union invades. So Poland really has no chance against these two powerful nations. Germans used a new tactic. They didn't want to get stuck fighting in trenches like in World War I, so they used mechanized infantry and tanks, so they used blitzkrieg, lightning war, so they wanted to attack quickly with these vehicles to overwhelm their enemy, and they used air superiority to bomb defensive positions, cities and airfields, bridges, logistical sites, supply lines. So this new form of warfare allows for the Nazis to conquer their neighbors easier than in World War I. Next, Nazi Germany turns its forces to the west, and they conquer the lowlands, Netherlands, and Belgium, and into France. So they conquer France. This was what they were unable to do in World War I, but they are able to defeat France in World War II, and they conquer France and force them to sign a treaty in Paris. And then they begin bombing Great Britain, which you can see here across the English Channel. Next, the Germans turn their forces with their allies east to conquer their hated enemies, the communists, and they invade the Soviet Union, much to Stalin's surprise, with the hopes of capturing Moscow before winter and before the battlefields turn to mud and then bitter cold and snow. This battle here between Germany and the Soviet Union will be the most ferocious fighting and loss of life in human history. Now, once war breaks out, the United States is still neutral. FDR delivers his Four Freedoms speech. This is after much of Europe had fallen to the Nazis. Great Britain was barely holding on as it was being bombed and surrounded by German U-boats. Franklin Roosevelt presented his reasons for American involvement. So this is a speech trying to convince Americans to support America's involvement in the war. He wanted to help Britain. Britain would kind of do our fighting for us until Roosevelt could convince the American people in Congress to declare war. He says that the United States is fighting for universal freedoms that all people possessed. So in order to do this, in 1941, Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act at Roosevelt's urging. It allows for the president, the U.S. government, to lend or lease rather than sell war supplies, because our allies didn't have a lot of money because they were fighting these totalitarian states. So we could lend or lease this equipment to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. So a lot of these supplies are going to be lent to Great Britain. FDR famously said, well, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you would loan him your water hose to put it out. And this is also going to begin boosting the American economy, and we're going to begin to emerge from the Great Depression because of our war production. In summer of 1941, August, FDR meets with Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill's battling the Nazis mostly in the air currently, and they discuss their war aims. The United States is heavily supplying Winston Churchill and assisting in the Atlantic Ocean with U-boats, defending against U-boats. So they met at sea on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean. So there's Winston Churchill. He's the Democratic leader of Great Britain. Famously gives the darkest hour speech stating Britain will fight in the land, sea, the streets, the beaches. He refuses to negotiate with Adolf Hitler once the war breaks out, and he rallies the British people, and Britain wins the Battle of Britain mostly in the air, and Adolf Hitler gives up on his designs for invasion of Great Britain, and he turns his forces. That's when Hitler turns his forces east and attacks the Soviet Union. Let's talk a little bit about Japan. So in Asia, the Japanese had been expanding their empire throughout the 1930s. Japan was a very crowded and highly populated series of islands, and they wanted more resources. And so they begin invading. They take Manchuria, which is Korea and northwest of Korea, northern China, and then they're going to begin invading China and subjugating Chinese and committing various horrible war crimes against the Chinese people. And a military officer, Hideki Tojo, becomes the leader of Japan with the permission of the Emperor Hirohito. And so what I previously already mentioned, Japan had been expanding, becoming very aggressive. The United States sees the aggressiveness of Japan. We begin refusing to supply them with certain materials like oil. And so Japan's looking for raw materials to fuel their war machine, especially their large navy and army. So in 1941, December, Japan decides to move its naval fleet across the Pacific Ocean and to launch a surprise attack against the American fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. And so this all occurs on the morning of December 7th, 1941. And luckily for the United States, our primary aircraft carrier group was not in the harbor at the time of the attack, and Japan fails to destroy several key pieces of American infrastructure in Pearl Harbor, but they do sink a number of American battleships and kill several thousand Americans. And this is the catalyst for the United States to declare war on Japan and Germany. So by the end of 1941, we have a more centralized alliance system. So we have the Allied powers with the United States, France, who have been conquered by the time the United States enters, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany. That's who we fight in World War II. So our next lecture will be about the United States involvement in the war, the home front, and American and Allied victory.